Before we dive in, drop a quick hi in the comments. It may seem small, but trust me, it really helps YouTube share this story with more sci-fi fans like us. I'd love to see who's watching.
10 years ago, New Carthage. The communications tower went first. 1 second, it was there, blinking its slow green pulse against the night sky, the way it had for 30 years. The next, it was a column of white fire that turned midnight into noon and sent the shockwave rolling through the colony streets, hard enough to knock people off their feet. Ren grabbed the doorframe of the grain processing office and held on while the windows flexed and the shelving behind him cascaded to the floor. He looked up. The sky was full of them. 3 HARVEST vessels dropped through the cloud cover, their hulls black and massive and running no lights. The burning tower lit them anyway, casting firelight across the rooftops, the square, and the faces of the people pouring from their homes into the street below. Someone was shouting about the orbital platform. Another person was shouting about the emergency channel. Neither of them understood yet that both were already gone, that the Krixx had taken out every means of calling for help before the first colonist had opened their eyes. The food depot on the colony's eastern edge went next. A precision strike blew apart the roof and eastern wall, setting the contents ablaze and sending black smoke into the pre-dawn sky. It made absolutely certain every person in New Carthage understood that the things they needed to survive were gone. Then the ore processing plant, the main power relay, the vehicle depot on the southern road. Each strike was precise. Each one targeted something necessary. The goal was not to kill as many people as possible, but to cripple the colony fast enough that everyone understood how much had already been lost. By the time the ramps dropped, Ren could count 11 separate fires from where he stood. The handlers came out in formation into the market square. Calm, organized, weapons up but not firing because there was nothing to fire at. The suppression had worked exactly as designed. The population of New Carthage was already in the square, driven there by the strikes, the smoke, and the instinct to find open ground, pressing tightly against each other as fear erased the space between people. Then the handler started moving through them. The scanner swept across faces, across bodies. The gestures came. Left, right. One group, a second group, and the crowd that had been pressing together began to be pulled apart, and that was when the noise started. The boy was maybe 7 years old, small even for that. He had been holding his mother's hand when the handler separated them, scooping him up in one motion. The boy twisted immediately, reaching back toward her, and screamed her name with the absolute conviction of a child who believed the world could still be corrected if he was loud enough. His mother heard him. She turned, and she fought. She went for the handler immediately, hitting with her hands, her elbows, anything she could force into motion through the crush of bodies around her. She was still fighting when 2 more handlers caught her arms and dragged her backward toward a third group. She kept her eyes on the boy the entire time. She was still reaching for him when they pulled her up the ramp. Still reaching when it closed. The boy screamed her name until the collection ship sealed, cutting the sound off so abruptly that the square felt quieter than it had any right to be. Ren stood at the edge of the square, with his back against the wall of the grain processing office, and watched the scanner sweep across him while the handler's flat yellow eyes followed the result. The calculation happened instantly somewhere behind those eyes. Automatic, emotionless, without a trace of hatred or satisfaction or anything that looked remotely human. Not worth the cargo space. The handler moved on. That was what nobody truly understood about the Krixx, unless they had seen a harvest operation themselves. They did not hate New Carthage. There was no rage in them, no contempt, nothing that looked like the face of an enemy. They were handlers running a collection operation, and they were very good at it. The children went left. The men with the broad shoulders and hands shaped by frontier labor went right. Certain women, selected by a secondary device the handlers consulted with careful attention, were directed toward the third craft reserved for the interstellar black markets that trafficked almost exclusively in female bodies, taken from conquered species across the frontier. The elderly stayed behind, not out of mercy. They simply had no value to the harvest. For 4 hours, the Krixx worked in rotation, fresh handlers cycling through while others processed and loaded. When the ramps finally lifted and the ships disappeared into the smoke-filled sky above New Carthage, maybe 200 people remained in the market square. Old, slow, abandoned with the same indifference used for cargo that failed inspection. No sound remained except wind moving through doors that would never close again. Ren went inside and sat at the desk where he had worked for 19 years, staring at his hands for a long time before finally looking away. New Carthage held on for 3 more months before rescue ships finally arrived. Present day. Year 3850, 10 years after the fall of New Carthage. Human colony, Cassandra, 12. The survivors of New Carthage did not stay together. They scattered across the frontier the way smoke scatters, thin and wide, carried by whatever transport would take them. Some ended up at other colonies. Some disappeared into the outer stations. Some, over the years, found their way to Cassandra 12. They brought nothing except memory and hard-earned knowledge about what the Krixx really were. It was enough. Cassandra 12 had 3 kinds of people, and over 10 years they became one thing. The original colonists, miners, ore technicians, logistics workers, and corridor welders, who knew the physical structure of Cassandra 12 as intimately as their own hands. Over time, they reshaped the colony quietly and methodically, turning ordinary infrastructure into defensive positions designed for a war they believed would eventually come. The refugees, survivors who understood what the Krixx did to colonies that were not prepared. They walked the corridors and pointed at junctions and said, "Here. Funnel them here. Put your people above and behind, and make them walk into it before they understand what it is." They looked at ventilation shafts, maintenance crawlways, and storage bays, and saw not infrastructure, but the shape of the next fight. And the children, born after New Carthage, raised inside the preparation the way other children were raised inside school schedules. They learned rally points before they learned to read. They ran drills in the dark because the Krixx cut power first, and everyone needed to function without it. They stripped weapons by touch and knew every fallback route in their district before they were 10 years old. For them, it was not grief, not even particularly heavy. It was just how they lived. Over 10 years, the colony changed in ways that would not have been obvious to anyone arriving from the outside. Residential districts still looked residential. Industrial output remained normal. Population numbers stayed stable. Nothing about Cassandra 12 suggested a fortress at first glance, but certain corridors funneled inward in ways that looked like ordinary renovation, and were not. Certain walls were thicker than any load-bearing requirement demanded. Certain maintenance rooms held locks that appeared on no official schematic. 7 hidden armories known only to cell leaders. Compartment lockdown systems wired to manual triggers that any adult could activate from 12 different points across the colony. It did not look like a fortress. Every centimeter of it was. 10 years after New Carthage, the Krixx finally arrived at Cassandra 12. The fleet emerged from dark transit at 0340 colony time. 4 vessels dropped into real space above the colony in perfect formation. 2 collection ships, 1 suppression platform, and a command vessel running slightly above and behind the others, with its external lights dark. The suppression platform immediately moved against Cassandra 12's orbital infrastructure. The communications relay died first. then the sensor buoys. The entire engagement lasted less time than it took to drink a cup of coffee. Then the collection ships began their descent. On the command vessel, HARVEST Director Vethak Sol reviewed the operational brief with the calm precision of a handler who had repeated this process often enough for it to feel routine. 41 HARVEST operations across 11 frontier systems had taught him the same lesson repeatedly. Confidence was useful. Arrogance was fatal. The profession rewarded preparation, pattern recognition, and the ability to remain calm while entire populations collapsed around you. He reviewed the target profile again. Cassandra 12, Frontier Colony. Population estimate, 4,300. Primary industries, ore processing, and logistics support. Defensive infrastructure minimal. The operational file had been assembled over 24 months from trade manifests, port records, cargo registrations, and second-hand reports purchased from species that had dealt with Cassandra 12 often enough to think they understood the colony. He closed the file without concern. At 0347, the descent order went out across the fleet. Below him, Cassandra 12 remained dark across most of its surface, quiet beneath the drifting cloud cover. In Vethak Sol's experience, colonies were always quiet at the beginning. Fear and confusion usually needed a few more minutes to fully spread through a population. Vethak Sol had no reason to believe this colony would be different. The first boarding craft touched the southern landing pad. The pad was empty. The colony beyond it remained dark beneath the cloud cover. The boarding commander logged the blackout as probable orbital suppression damage and moved his team off the ramp in standard formation. 20 handlers, 6 armed escorts, scanners active, weapons ready. The southern district was residential and light commercial, a grid of low structures, covered walkways, and narrow corridors between buildings. There should have been movement somewhere ahead of them. Civilians running, voices echoing through the corridors, panic spreading after the arrival of the collection ships. Instead, the corridor ahead remained empty and still. The commander stopped at the edge of the landing pad and swept his scanner down the primary corridor. Life signs appeared immediately, multiple contacts positioned above and to both sides. In a layered pattern, his threat assessment systems flagged before he consciously understood what he was seeing. None of them were moving. He raised his fist, and the formation halted. A second later, the floor lighting activated. Emergency strips flooded the corridor in dim red light, just enough illumination to track movement without properly revealing the space around them. Deliberate lighting, controlled lighting. Then the mag locks released. A barricade slammed down along his left flank, plasteel panels and welded mining equipment sealing the side corridor he had intended to use for maneuvering. Before the impact stopped echoing, a second barricade dropped across the primary corridor ahead of them. Figures appeared along the top of it. Humans stood behind the barricade without speaking or moving, watching the boarding party with the composure of people who had been waiting in those positions long before the first Krixx vessel entered orbit. Behind the Krixx formation, the landing pad doors sealed shut under heavy manual mag locks, activated from somewhere deeper inside the colony. The commander turned just in time to see 3 humans already inside his perimeter. He had not seen them approach. He could not identify where they had entered from. The first shot came from above and to the left. The second hit an escort from behind before he could turn toward it. The third came from the barricade itself. The attack did not resemble any suppression pattern the commander recognized. Fire came from multiple directions almost simultaneously, and every time his escorts locked onto a firing position, the shooters had already vanished into maintenance crawlways, hidden access routes, or spaces the schematics insisted were solid walls. The bursts stayed short and controlled. Gunfire erupted from one direction, disappeared, then resumed somewhere else entirely before return fire could stabilize. His escorts reacted exactly as trained. They repositioned, covered each other's movement, and returned fire with disciplined precision. But the colony itself seemed designed to break those responses apart. 2 handlers went down almost immediately, while the attackers continued moving through corridors and access points that should not have existed at all. The commander pulled the surviving team into a defensive cluster and called for support. He stayed calm under fire, reorganized correctly, followed procedure exactly. On the command vessel, Vethak Sol received the contact report. He listened to it once, then pulled the simultaneous reports from boarding parties 2 and 3 operating in the Eastern Processing District and Northern Residential Block. All 3 teams were in contact. All 3 reported structured resistance, barricades in positions absent from every schematic in his database, coordinated fire from multiple vectors, targets that struck and disappeared before return fire could stabilize. No civilian collapse, no scatter, nothing that matched the behavioral profile of a frontier population during a harvest operation. He brought up the colony schematics beside the live sensor feed from the ground teams and studied them in silence. The schematics showed a standard colonial settlement, open corridors, predictable infrastructure, civilian construction. The live feed showed something else entirely. Vethak Sol lowered the operational brief onto the console beside him. For the first time in his career, the numbers no longer meant anything. Outside the viewport, Cassandra 12 remained dark and quiet beneath the fleet, unchanged from orbit. Nothing about it looked different from the colony they had approached. Inside, it was something else entirely. "Pull additional boarding units from the collection ships," Vethak Sol said. "Full combat load, and get me a live structural assessment of that colony." His adjutant moved to comply, then hesitated. "Director," he said carefully, "the live scan is arriving now." Vethak Sol looked at it. The colony no longer matched the operational file. Hidden reinforcement layers, rerouted corridors, internal structures absent from every schematic in the database. The modifications were not recent. He understood then that the humans had not improvised this resistance after the fleet arrived. "Recalculate the operation timeline," he said quietly. "By how much, Director?" Vethak Sol watched the boarding teams pinned inside defensive corridors, engineered to hold them there, while human defenders moved through the colony with the calm coordination of people repeating something they had rehearsed until it became instinct. "I don't know yet," he said. Below him, Cassandra 12 waited in the dark. It had been waiting for 10 years. Davar did not pace. Pacing was for men who had not already made every decision worth making. He sat at the command console in the reinforced coordination room 3 levels below the colony surface and watched his board the way a surgeon watches vitals. Steady, reading everything, reacting to nothing until reaction was required. The room was small, functional. A folding table, 3 consoles, a wall of hand-drawn schematics that predated every digital update by years because Davar trusted paper when the power went out. 2 runners sat by the door, trained. They did not speak unless spoken to, and they did not look at the board unless told to. He had spent 10 years building Cassandra 12 into something the Krixx could not swallow in 4 hours. Kill funnels, hidden armories, compartment lockdown triggers, fallback routes marked across paper schematics spread over his desk, night after night. He had done it the way you do anything that matters. Quietly, methodically, without asking permission from people who would have called it unnecessary. Now the board was lit across all 3 districts, and he was reading what it told him. The contact reports had changed, not the volume, the pattern. The Krixx were moving differently, tighter formations, coordinated suppression fire before advancing instead of after. Units leapfrogging each other through corridors instead of pushing straight. These were not handlers running a collection sweep. These were soldiers running a clearance operation. Davar watched the pattern for 10 seconds. Then he reached for the comm. All districts, he said quietly. They shifted doctrine. Fall back to secondary positions. Do not hold primary lines. Let them have the corridors, and make them pay for the rooms. He released the comm and watched the board begin to adjust. They had prepared for this, too. Priest did not need the comm order to know. He had felt the shift before it came through. Felt it in the way the Krixx fire patterns changed at the Northern Block's main junction. In the way the pressure at Barricade 3 went from probing to deliberate. In the way the unit pushing down Corridor 7 stopped, pulled back, and came again from a different angle instead of the same one. They were learning. He stood at the junction of two corridors in the northern residential block, and he was completely still in the dark. No lights. He did not need them. He had walked these corridors so many times in blackout drills that his feet knew the floor better than his eyes did. Behind him, his fighters waited. He could hear them breathing. One of them, a young man named Seth, who had been born in this colony and had never known it any other way, was breathing faster than the others. Not from fear, from readiness. There was a difference, and Priest knew it because he had trained Seth himself. "They're at the junction," the runner on his left murmured. "I know," Priest said. He waited. The Krixx unit came around the corner in tight formation, suppression pair leading. Flankers close to the walls, a rear unit hanging back to cover withdrawal if the corridor collapsed into contact. Textbook clearance. Professional. The kind of formation you used when you expected resistance waiting ahead. Priest let the suppression pair get past the junction marker scratched into the floor years ago. "Now," he said. The ceiling panel released, weighted with salvaged ore processing equipment, designed by Davar and installed by Priest with his own hands. It did not kill them. It put them on the floor and kept them there. His fighters hit the flankers from both sides simultaneously. It was over fast. Priest looked at what was left. 2 Krixx down and not getting up. 2 pinned under the panel, alive, going nowhere. The rear unit had pulled back around the corner, regrouping, calling it in. "Fall back," Priest said. "Secondary positions. Move." They moved. Seth was last, covering the retreat. Short controlled bursts at the corner to keep the rear unit honest. They were sealed into a fallback room before the Krixx rear unit came around the corner and found nothing but an empty junction and their pinned colleagues and silence. Priest sat with his back against the wall and looked at his fighters. All present. Breathing. For the moment, that was enough. But the pressure was building, and he knew his district better than anyone. He knew exactly which wall was going to crack first. He keyed his comm. "Northern block holding," he told Davar. "They're learning fast." "I know," Davar said. "Hold what you can. Abandon what you can't." "Understood," Priest said, rising from the wall a second later. The wall cracked 20 minutes later. The Krixx found the maintenance bypass hidden behind Barricade 7. Priest never learned how. Maybe they forced open a panel that had been meant to stay sealed. Maybe one of them simply noticed something another species would have ignored. Either way, the route carried them behind his secondary line and turned his fallback position into another front. They came through fast. Krixx clearance units moved with the efficiency of professionals who had finally found a seam and intended to pull it open before it closed again. Priest got most of his people out. Not Seth. Seth was covering the interior hatch when the Krixx broke through. There was no room to maneuver and no time to pull him back. Priest sealed the corridor section because closing it cost 1 life, and leaving it open would have cost 4. He stood in the tertiary fallback corridor with 4 fighters and listened to the silence where Seth had been and felt the weight of the correct decision settle into him like something that would never fully leave. "Tertiary positions," he said. His voice was the same as it always was. "Move." They moved. He keyed Devar. "Northern block. Barricade 7 is gone. We lost a section. Falling back to tertiary." A pause. "Understood," Devar said. "Hold tertiary." "We'll hold it," Priest said. He did not mention Seth. Devar's board would already show the loss, and neither of them needed to say the name out loud for it to become real. Rusk was at the southern landing pad access hatch, flat against the wall in the dark. Marines behind him in a stack so quiet, you could hear the distant concussion of corridor fighting 3 districts over and nothing else. He was not a tall man, not the largest Marine in the colony by any measure. He had a face that looked like it had been used for something other than a face at some point, and had mostly recovered. He did not give speeches before actions. He did not give preambles. He had been running combat drills in this colony for years, and every Marine behind him had heard everything he considered worth saying, approximately 400 times in those years. They did not need words now. He held up 2 fingers, then pointed at the pad schematic scratched on the wall beside the hatch. The boarding craft was still on the pad. His scout had confirmed what he already suspected. Skeleton crew. The main force was deep in the southern district corridors, working through kill funnels that would keep them occupied for a long time yet. He held up 3 fingers, then 2, then 1. The hatch opened. They went through fast and low, and the pad was exactly as described. The boarding craft sat on its landing struts with its ramp up and its running lights dim. 2 Krixx guards on the exterior, 1 at the ramp base, 1 walking the perimeter. The perimeter walker went down before he completed his turn. The ramp guard had time to raise his weapon, not enough time to use it. Rusk hit the ramp controls himself. The ramp dropped. He went up it with the first Marines tight behind him, and the interior of the craft was small and functional and alien-smelling, and the pilot was exactly where a pilot should be, in the forward seat, spinning around at the sound of the ramp with an expression Rusk had no framework for reading on a Krixx face, but understood immediately regardless. Young. The pilot was young. The scales around his throat were still the pale, undersaturated color of an animal that had not yet fully matured. His hands came up, and Rusk was not sure if it was a reaching for weapon motion or a surrender motion, so he made the distinction irrelevant by closing the distance and making his own intentions extremely clear, without using any words at all. The pilot's hand stayed up. "You're going to fly this back to the collection ship," Rusk said. "You're going to use your codes. You're going to say whatever you normally say when you're coming back from a ground operation. You're going to do all of that correctly." The pilot stared at him, while the translator rendered the words into the Krixx language through the small speaker mounted beneath it. "Nod if you understood me," Rusk said. The pilot nodded. "Good," Rusk said. He stepped back 1 pace. "Do it wrong once, and we find out if this thing flies without a pilot. You understand that also?" The pilot nodded again. "Faster." Rusk looked at his Marines. He looked at the interior of the craft. Functional. Cramped. Nothing he recognized except the basic logic of a vehicle designed to move bodies from one place to another. He sat down in the nearest seat and worked a harness that was not built for human proportions until it held anyway. "Take us up," he said. The craft lifted. The collection ship bay doors opened without challenge. The transponder was valid. So was the clearance code the pilot transmitted, while Rusk stood nearby with Marines positioned where the pilot could see them clearly. In the middle of an escalating harvest operation, the bay controller logged the returning craft, cleared its approach vector, and opened the doors the same way he had done dozens of times already that night. The craft settled into the bay. The ramp dropped. Rusk came out first. The bay crew had exactly the wrong amount of time to understand what they were seeing, enough to see it, not enough to do anything about it. The Marines moved through the bay fast and low and ugly. They were not comfortable. The gravity was slightly wrong, and the lighting was the deep amber of Krixx interior systems, and nothing smelled right. None of that slowed them. The bay was secured. Rusk grabbed the pilot by the collar and put him at the front of the column. "Communications deck," he said. "Take us there. Now." The pilot moved. Marines followed. Through corridors that meant nothing to human eyes until the pilot stopped at a hatch and Rusk put a hand on his shoulder and the pilot opened it. The communications crew had time to stand up. That was all. The partial transmission that escaped before the console was seized was 11 words in Krixx operational code. Contact in bay, nature unknown, stand by for, and then nothing. Rusk looked at the silenced console, at the Marines holding the communications deck, at the corridor beyond the sealed hatch, where he could already hear the sound of the remaining crew regrouping in the forward sections. They held the bay. They held the communications deck. The rest of the ship was Krixx territory, and the sound from forward told him the crew was not going to leave it that way for long. He keyed his ground comm. The signal pushed through the hull weakly, but it pushed through. "Devar," Rusk said. "We're on the collection ship. Bay and comms are ours. Forward sections are still theirs." A pause. "Understood," Devar said. "Hold what you have." "Working on it," Rusk said. He looked at his Marines, trapped on a hostile alien ship. Enemy crew regrouping forward. No extraction route. Ground battle still running below them. "Seal the bay doors," he said, "and find me something we can use as a barricade." On the command vessel, Vethak Sol received the partial transmission and listened to it twice. Contact in bay. Nature unknown. Stand by. He sent a retrieval craft to the collection ship immediately. The craft launched and moved into approach position and could not dock. The bay doors were sealed from inside and not responding to external override. His adjutant reported this without inflection. Vethak Sol considered a forced hull breach, a retrieval team cutting through the exterior. He ran it against what he knew about the collection ship's internal configuration. A breach attempt risked catastrophic decompression across sections that still held his own crew. Until he knew exactly where his people were inside that ship, a forced entry could kill more of his own than the humans had. He held the retrieval craft in position, waiting, watching the sealed doors. Then he pulled the bay approach log, reviewed the life sign count on the returning craft, cross-referenced it against the manifest of the boarding party that had deployed to the southern district. The numbers did not match. He set the log down. He looked at his tactical display, the colony below, still resisting across all 3 districts, his reinforced units making progress, too slowly. The collection ship, compromised, bay sealed, crew status unknown, the retrieval craft sitting outside doors that would not open. He pulled the system edge sensors. The fleet transit signature was there. Faint. A human armada moving in-system at the edge of his long-range detection. He ran the calculation and didn't like the result. Hours, not days. He looked at the colony for a long time. Devar's board registered the southern district deteriorating in the same moment. With Rusk gone and the skeleton crew ambushed, the Krixx ground units in the southern corridors had pushed harder, found less resistance at the pad perimeter, begun pressing the remaining defenders back toward the central fallback positions. The southern thread was fraying. Devar noted it, adjusted the fallback order for the southern cell, bought them more time in smaller increments. He was still doing the math when his proximity alert fired. The suppression platform was repositioning. He stared at the signature, ran the calculation. The platform wasn't moving to a new orbital station. It was moving to a bombardment angle. Direct colony strike. Area denial. Not precision. Extermination. Devar keyed every comm channel simultaneously. All districts. Platform is repositioning for bombardment. Fall back to deep shelters. Now. Move! He keyed Rusk separately. They're going to burn the colony, he said. How long can you hold that ship? On the collection ship, Rusk looked at the barricade his Marines had built across the forward corridor from everything they could pull from the bay. Looked at the sealed doors behind him. Looked at his Marines. Looked at the young Krixx pilot sitting against the wall with his pale, scaled throat, and his first operation, and his expression of an animal that had wandered very far from anything it understood. Long enough, Rusk said. Do something with that time, Davar. Davar looked at his board, at the suppression platform moving into bombardment position, at the fleet signature on the system edge that was not close enough. Not yet, but closer than it had been. Working on it, he said. On the command vessel, Vethak Sol watched the suppression platform complete its repositioning and felt nothing in particular about what came next. He had come to run a harvest. The harvest was over. What remained was the message. Fire when ready, he said. The suppression platform did not fire everything at once. That was the thing Davar had not fully anticipated, not the bombardment itself. He had built the deep shelters for that. What he had not anticipated was the patience of it, section by section. The way you demolish something you intend to leave as rubble rather than crater. He sat 3 levels below the surface and listened to the colony come apart above him in increments and watched his board go dark, 1 section at a time. Southern Cell, down to a voice he did not recognize. Holding deep shelter, the voice said. We have wounded. Stay down, Davar said. Northern block, Priest's marker still active, still transmitting. He keyed the fleet signature on the system edge, closer. The math was still the math, and the math said not yet, and above him the board kept going dark. He keyed Rusk. Platform is still firing, he said. Tell me you have something. On the collection ship, Rusk stood at the barricade his Marines had built across the forward corridor and listened to the quality of the silence coming from the sections beyond it, the difference between disarray and preparation. He had heard that difference enough times to recognize it without seeing it. Holding was not going to be enough. He stepped back and looked at the young pilot sitting against the bulkhead with his pale, scaled throat and his hands loose in his lap and his eyes somewhere that was not this room. Rusk crouched in front of him. Propulsion and navigation, Rusk said. Can you access them from the communications deck? The pilot looked at him. The translator converted the Krixx response into human speech a second later. During Bay lockdown, the emergency routing mirrors flight control to communications, it said. Yes. Then get up, Rusk said. The pilot got up. At the communications console, his hands moved with the automatic confidence of someone who had trained on these systems before they were old enough to run a harvest operation. Rusk stood behind him and understood enough of what he was seeing. Set a collision course with the command vessel, Rusk said. Slow. I want Vethak Sol to see it coming and have enough time to understand what it means. The pilot's hand stopped. He did not look at Rusk. He looked at the display, at the command vessel, at the geometry of what Rusk was describing. My crew is on this ship, the pilot said. I know, Rusk said. Set the course. Then get your crew to the evacuation pods. You have enough time to do both. The pilot sat with that. Rusk did not push him. He had made the offer, and the alternative was implicit, and neither of them had time for anything else. The pilot's hands moved again. The collection ship began to drift. Rusk keyed groundcom. Davar, he said. It's moving. Then he looked at the pilot. Go, he said. Get your people out. The pilot stood, looked at Rusk for a moment with an expression that did not translate and did not need to. Then he moved toward the forward sections to find what remained of his crew. Rusk watched him go, then turned back to the barricade. Whatever came next, they would hold it. On the command vessel, Vethak's soul saw the collection ship's trajectory change before his adjutant reported it. He ran the geometry once: mass, heading, time to impact. Then he looked at the suppression platform's firing angle and the debris envelope a kill shot would create at this range, and the command vessel sitting behind it. He could not fire on it. He could not board it in time. He could not stop the drift remotely. The ship's systems were not responding to external commands. "Cease bombardment," he said. "All power to maneuvering. Get us clear." The suppression platform went cold. In the deep shelters beneath Cassandra, 12, the sound that had been shaking the walls for the last hour, stopped. Davar looked at his board. He looked at the fleet signature, resolving now into individual vessels moving fast with the purposeful acceleration of a fleet that had seen the bombardment on approach and had not slowed down for it. He broadcast the message across every available channel at once. All districts. Platform stopped. Surface and engage. Move now. Then he keyed Priest separately. "It's time," he said. Priest was already standing when the comm came through. He brought his fighters up through maintenance hatches and crawlways into corridors that smelled of smoke and ruptured infrastructure. The northern block was different above tertiary. Sections open where ceilings had failed. Kill funnels partially collapsed. But the corridors were still corridors. The Krixx ground units were pulling back, organized withdrawal, professional to the end, toward the extraction points that ran through Priest's district. They hit the first withdrawing unit at the main junction. It was not clean. Withdrawing Krixx were not panicking Krixx, and they returned fire with discipline. One of Priest's fighters went down at the corner and did not get up, and Priest did not stop, because stopping was not something the moment allowed. The second unit had found the collapse of Barricade 7 and turned it into a defensive position to cover the withdrawal of the units behind them. Priest looked at it for 2 seconds, then looked at the collapsed ceiling section above it. It took 30 seconds to get into position through a crawlway he had built himself. The ceiling collapsed in a single, violent impact. Priest walked through without slowing. The extraction point was a landing pad on the northern edge. 2 boarding craft on the pad, ramps down, Krixx ground units streaming toward them. Priest stood at the corridor exit and looked at his fighters. Not enough to take the pad, enough to make it cost something. "Everything we have," he said. They hit the withdrawal from 2 angles and did not stop until the ramps went up and the craft lifted, then kept firing because stopping felt wrong. When the craft cleared range, Priest lowered his weapon. His shoulder had been bleeding into his jacket for a while. He noticed it now. He sat down at the corridor exit with his back against the wall and looked at the empty pad and the sky above it. Around him his fighters sat too, breathing, present. He did not count them. The human fleet neutralized the suppression platform in the opening exchange. Fast, precise. Cassandra 12 had been built around the assumption that one day the Krixx would return. Every hour the colony transmitted a status confirmation to military command beyond the frontier. If a report failed to arrive, emergency protocols treated the silence as hostile action immediately. The Krixx cut communications the moment they entered orbit, exactly as Cassandra 12 expected them to. By the time the harvest operation began, a human response fleet was already moving toward the colony, while long-range communications teams continued listening for any surviving transmission that might escape the blackout. The retrieval craft withdrew as the first human warships entered engagement range. Krixx ground units that had not yet reached extraction zones were cut off almost immediately. On the command vessel, Vethaxol watched the situation close around him with the clarity of a calculation that only had one possible answer. His adjutant waited. Vethaxol looked at the colony on the surface, still standing, still populated by people coming up out of shelters into the smoke-filtered light, and moving through the damage with purpose. He thought about the assessment. 18 months old. Minimal defense infrastructure. He thought about what 4,000 colonists had built in 10 years while the galaxy was not watching. The human fleet commander's message arrived on the open channel, transmitted in Krixx operational code, and broadcast openly enough for every ship in the sector to hear it. The collection ship and its crew would be returned. After the Krixx prisoners were processed, Vethaxol received it on an open channel that every vessel in the system, Krixx and human alike, was monitoring. He understood exactly what the open channel meant. This was not a negotiation. This was a record. Every ship in this system had just heard a Frontier Colonies fleet dictate terms to a Krixx HARVEST director. 41 operations. His name had meant something in the hegemony because of those 41 operations. It would still mean something after today. Something different. He looked at his adjutant. "Log this engagement," he said. "Full record. Every decision. Every outcome. Send it to the hegemony operational database before we complete withdrawal. Flag it for mandatory review before any future harvest operation targeting human space. Director? Any commander who runs a harvest against a human colony without reading this log," Vethaxol said quietly, "will not be making a mistake. They will be making a choice. I want that distinction documented." He looked out the viewport at Cassandra 12 getting smaller as they pulled away. Then he gave the withdrawal order and did not look back. Devar surfaced 2 hours after the gun stopped. The colony was still standing the way something can stand, while also being permanently different from what it was. Sections gone. The surface scored in long parallel lines where the platform had walked its strikes before Rusk's maneuver stopped it. He walked through it slowly. He passed the grain processing office, still standing. Windows gone. Interior open to the air and covered in the fine gray particulate that bombardment left on everything it did not destroy. He stopped in front of it. He thought about Seth, about the fighter he did not recognize who had gone down at the northern junction, about the count on his board that he had read and set aside because there had been no time, and then had not returned to, because returning to it did not change it. Around him, people moved through the damage carrying tools, lifting debris, checking the wounded, already beginning the work before the smoke had fully settled. Devar looked at the grain processing office for a moment longer. Then he turned away and walked back into what was left of his colony. The sky above Cassandra 12 was empty. They had paid for that.
Hey there, space human. I'm really curious about your thoughts on this video. Drop a quick comment and let me know what's on your mind. Or just say hi if you prefer. Either way, I'd love to hear from you. Also, remember to check the pinned comment. Trust me, it's worth a look. Oh, and one last thing. I've chosen another video for you to watch. Just click the card here, or here if you want the whole playlist. See you there.